Merry Christmas and welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the most important events of 2025 and the best books we read and films we saw in this year as it comes to an end. I'm joined, as always, by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So, how should we do this, guys? I think maybe we'll do this in the form of a snake draft. Are you familiar, Geoff and Ashley, with a snake draft?
No.
So we'll begin with the most important events of the year with Ashley, then we'll go to Geoff, and then me. But then when we move to the next category, I'll go first, and then Geoff will go, and then Ashley will go. Because what if we are stealing each other's most important events, or best books or films? So the snake draft is more fair than simply going around in the same order each time. And here's the rule. You cannot pick the same event, book or film as someone else. So if Geoff beats you to the punch, Ashley, you're going to have to think of something else. So Ashley, why don't you kick us off as 2025 comes to an end? What was the most significant event of the year?
I'm going to go with the obvious, although I was really going back and forth because, it was a tie-up between Trump saying that he's going to take Greenland, which seems kind of weird and like this edgelordy thing that he was doing, but I feel like it was symbolic of a kind of, I don't know, it was almost like Trump didn't have to follow through on it for it to be powerful, and not because it's like, sticking two fingers up at the establishment and this is what Trump does and so on, but also speaks to this kind of old idea of imperialism that was unabashedly powerful and expansionary and dreamed of greater things, however bad those great things might be, But I am going to go with Charlie Kirk. I'm going to go with the obvious thing. One, because we just had 1,000 submissions to Compact talking about Charlie Kirk. Everybody had a take. Everybody had a view on what the tragedy meant and what it said about our politics. And I'm going to give my take because I didn't get a chance. And I shouldn't laugh. I mean, it's obviously horrible. I managed to avoid seeing the awful nature of this incident, but everybody else seemed to. So it was really an interesting and horrifying and revealing incident and event because, one, it revealed like just the uncensored gore that we all see every day, and this was just sort of staring us in the face, whether we liked it or not. And I feel quite ambivalent about that. On the one hand, people were sharing videos of war zones and so on, saying you shouldn't shy away from the truth. This is the truth. And on the other hand, it's like there's a loss of some kind of basic humanity when you watch on, all day, every day, when some event happens, this endless, every possible angle of the horror, that it takes something away from you. It blots your soul in a way. And I feel like the internet has, I actively avoid this stuff, but it is, any kind of innocence that I want to have about certain things is gone because I have seen the horror, whether I liked it or not, of terrible accidents. And, we wonder why people have anxiety. They're like, well, why are people so anxious? Like, how much gore have you seen by the time you're 18? I mean, that's not normal, except for people who've lived in war zones and they like twitch randomly throughout the rest of their lives. Like, that's crazy. So that was one of the reasons why it stood out. And then obviously it stands out because it revealed the emptiness of the opportunism of the stance on free speech of a lot of people. And this is something that I don't know why people really struggle with. And I get accused of this as well, just being sort of fair weather defenders of free speech, because whenever something happens, people want to say, no, you have to be consistent. You have to defend free speech on all sides. And I do try to do that. I try to do that as much as I can. But in this case, it was like, the right, I don't know, the center right, whatever you want to call them, they they revealed that they only cared about free speech because they were the ones who were the victims of it. And it just exposed this incredible lack of principle that we have in politics. It's just everybody's just trying to own each other, blame each other, and there was no principled defense of freedom of speech. You needed to be able to defend your opponent saying horrible things, or else you did not have any ground to stand on when it came to yourself, because everybody who cares about something doesn't like that thing having bad things said about it. That's why we have the principle of free speech. Nobody ever thought it was important to defend free speech to the death because people wanted to talk about sunflowers and cupcakes. They defend free speech because it's specifically the right to be offensive, to offend people, because no matter what you say, it's going to offend somebody if you're going to have anything important to say, or even just you're going to have something to say. You got to, and this is going to sort of bleed into our discussion of books, because one of the books that I read this year was Tiffany Jenkins' Strangers and Intimates, where she talks about how, the Scottish government was one of the first countries in the world to remove the protection of free speech in your home. And I remember when that was happening, people were saying, well, why do you need to be a racist in your home? I don't need a reason. Nobody needs a reason. Just sometimes you're sloppy and horrible in your home. That's just it. And there's very little space in society to be sloppy and horrible because, our public fora are connected to our living rooms. And we need to be able to try out ideas and say stupid things. I feel like, and be offensive and have debates and have somebody yell at you and get mad and so on. It's part of, that's the price we pay for freedom of speech. And I saw the right policing that and policing civility and, and not just like literally policing it, doing the exact same thing, and everybody was united across the political spectrum and saying freedom of speech is not freedom from consequences. That's okay. We can't agree on anything, but I can agree on this. I should be able to get you fired from your job when I don't like what you say. And I thought that was a really revealing moment, because for a long time, the right had been the last bastion of classical liberalism. People who were classical liberals, who had Enlightenment thinkers and so on, had been kicked out of the left, and they found a home on the right. And it just showed that a lot of those people began to let go of those classical liberal principles. And that I found to be extremely worrying.
It's been really remarkable to see the fracturing of the American right in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination. That was on display, I think, this weekend at this kind of so-called America Fest hosted by Turning Point USA. And there you had Ben Shapiro attacking Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson, and then you had Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly attacking Ben Shapiro. And somehow it does seem that Kirk was a kind of unifying node on the American right. Now, I do think that the hagiographic element that has naturally emerged in the wake of his terrible killing has obscured his own role in seeking to promote a kind of project that has pretty obvious contradictions. I mean, how well can one actually reconcile the political outlooks of a Ben Shapiro and a Tucker Carlson? I think that's pretty hard. I mean, America, it's a messy country, and any political coalition is going to contain pretty sharply opposed elements. And I guess that's the art of politics, to try to hold them together. But I do wonder, how long could Kirk have kind of kept this kind of high wire act up? Maybe a bit longer, and certainly it doesn't seem that anyone else is as capable of unifying these opposing elements as he was. Geoff, what do you got for the event of the year?
A somewhat more drawn out event, which would be the rise and fall of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency.
Like half the year and say, I'm claiming on 6 full months as the event of the year.
Well, I'm thinking of the event in the Alain Badiou's sense of the événement.
Oh yes, Badiou's sense.
Oh no, I'm not sure if Doge qualifies as that. What I've written about this previously is, what is Doge? Well, originally it's a meme, then it becomes a meme coin, So it sort of does raise all of these questions of what an event is in the digital age. And I find it an interesting and telling part of this year's trajectory, in part because, as I've mentioned before, I'm working on a book that partly takes me back into the early years of the internet, well, of the, let's say, the public civilian internet in the 1990s, when you had the initial articulations of various kinds of techno-utopianism, as well as, I'd say, an initial form of what's now called the tech right, which is, specifically understood as an alliance between Silicon Valley and the Republican Party. This was the Republican Party of Newt Gingrich, who came into power as Speaker of the House in 1995, which was a major watershed year for digital technology. The internet as we know it really kind of came into something like a recognizable form during that year. And in the middle of that year, Gingrich was interviewed by Wired magazine, the sort of in-house glossy of the Silicon Valley economy. And basically, Gingrich is sort of, he's treated somewhat critically in terms of his overall, tendency to kind of align with the sort of moralism of Christian conservatives and so on. And that will eventually come to a head and sort of help split this nascent alliance between the Republicans and Silicon Valley in the late 90s. But in this period, there's a lot of kind of playing footsie between the two camps. And the thing that's interesting is that, Gingrich shows up in Washington in 1995, arguing that the time has really come to roll back the federal government and to, bring America back to where it was before the sort of consolidation of power in Washington, D.C., and have a much more kind of, to return power to the states, to local communities, etc. And the thing that is going to enable this, and this is why his alliance with the Silicon Valley crowd is so important, is specifically digital technology. So the idea is that digital technology is inherently decentralizing, and therefore it's the thing that is going to enable us to basically dismantle the federal government, because we don't need it anyway. We'll have this kind of cyber, I think of it as this kind of cybernetic neo-pastoralism where, this idea that America can just kind of return to its Jeffersonian roots as a society of homesteaders and kind of, small scale yeomen. But this will be enabled by digital technology, by the decentralizing effects of digital technology. So this is really kind of the attempted fusion between Gingrich and the Wired sort of Silicon Valley set of the period. And so the thing that's interesting to me about Doge is really it kind of comes into what, it shows up in Washington just really rehashing this same idea that, because we've created these technologies that allow us to do so many things, in a sort of, to root around government in a sense, we can just sort of dismantle the federal government and replace it with these kind of privatized technological infrastructures. And so, what's interesting about Doge is I think that first of all, is the sort of obliviousness of its architects to why this whole project repeatedly failed to. And the thing, that's worth noting here is that the institutional form that Doge takes is actually that it assumes the mantle of this entity created under the Obama administration. The specific point of which, once again, was to kind of bring the expertise of Silicon Valley in to streamline government and make it more kind of responsive to the public, and to bring about greater efficiency through the marvels of technology. And so the point is, both Republicans and Democrats have tried different versions of this project. For various reasons, it hasn't panned out. And so I think what's interesting is that Doge is the resurrection of this eternal dream that somehow we can that somehow we can, return to some sort of simpler version of America, paradoxically through the intervention of these sort of complex technologies. And, there are many other things that I could say about it. But, one thing that's interesting is the kind of historical myopia of the people involved in it, that they didn't really seem to grasp why this project had failed in the past. That there was also a way that it had converted this into a really, or it has fused this project with something that was much more sort of vengeful and vindictive, that I think, again, speaks to the way that generations of Republicans going back to Gingrich and earlier had in various ways attempted to kind of take on the juggernaut of the ever expanding federal government, and had repeatedly felt themselves stymied. And so this, in a way, felt like this kind of chaotic last ditch effort to finally realize this project. And the thing that was most notable about it was that the point at which the project really collapsed and its fate was sealed was to do with the big beautiful bill that was passed by the Republican Congress at the urging of Donald Trump in the spring. And it was at this point that Elon Musk, the driving force behind Doge, basically seemed to have some kind of black pill moment where he realized that actually most of these Republicans aren't really that serious about this project of downsizing the federal government and bringing about more efficiency, because they've just created this bill which is just a very typical sort of monstrosity of a sort of continuing funding resolution. And that it was as if Musk again did seem to really believe in the same way that the early figures in the mid-90s believed, that the technologies that he had been involved in creating just sort of made this whole bureaucratic monstrosity of the federal government just a dinosaur that could just be kind of could just be kind of slain and swept aside. And yet, he found himself confronted with the fact that politics is still what it is, the democratic process is still what it is, and the democratic process repeatedly results in the perpetuation and continued expansion of the federal government. And so I think that, and so, the final thing I'll say is kind of interesting here is that, the ideal originally informing this sort of neo-pastoral vision that comes out of Silicon Valley, that I think was strangely resurrected in Doge, is this, is connected in theory to this ideal of Jeffersonian democracy. And yet, the actual process of American democracy does not result in, and so what's interesting is that the does not result in anything resembling this sort of utopian vision. And so that you end up with this contradiction where the restoration of democracy as it's in its idealized form would seem to require the destruction of democracy as it actually, of electoral democracy as it actually exists. So the book that I will discuss shortly is it will allow me to continue to talk on this theme, but I do think it was a significant the defeat of Doge. I think was a significant and revealing moment in terms of the continued failure of the political project that's driven Silicon Valley in its attempts to influence politics.
What are the most significant events of recent years? I think of certainly the repeal of Roe v. Wade, the October 7 attack on Israel in 2025. I don't think we've seen anything quite on that level. But I would define another Badiou type event, which is Trump's war on the universities, specifically his confrontation with Harvard, which I think is going to reshape American life in various ways. America still is the beacon for the whole world. a lot of people look up to it, aspire to be like it. They may kind of profess an anti-Americanism, which is obviously, an opinion that's not uncommon here in America. But it's still, just in terms of its power and prosperity, something that people, seek to emulate and that people envy, even if they also resent it. And people within America and elsewhere look up to our Ivies, look up to Harvard, to Princeton, to Yale, to Columbia. These are hugely important institutions globally. And, Trump is remaking them. And a couple things seem worth noting here. One, just universities have been politicized, and I think they're going to have to recalibrate politically. There are almost no Republicans on the faculty of these schools, and probably even fewer people who would be identifiable as, committed right wingers in the way that many university faculty members are committed leftists. And I tend to think that's going to have to change unless these universities want to keep getting hammered every time a Republican is elected. So I think there is going to be a rebalancing. Maybe it'll only be cosmetic or quite slight, but there will be a rebalancing in these schools. Also, just the very lavish research funding we've seen for these schools is probably at an end. It'll continue, to a certain degree, but it'll just never be what it once was. And Norman Matloff, the former UC Davis computer scientist, the retired professor, wrote for us about this in a recent article for Compact. So yeah, I'd say that the war on the universities, where what Trump is really asserting, what the GOP, populist GOP behind him is asserting, I think, is that these are institutions that have to be accountable to the political community, to the American political community. And why is that? Well, these are our elite forming institutions. This is how the American elite is constituted. So, just as, West Point creates the leaders of the United States Army, or kind of Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, whatever, and the broader range of, whatever, top 12 or 15 schools constitute the American governing class more generally. And that makes all of their activities something of kind of immediate and intense interest to all Americans. And if these universities are going to try to hold on to these important civic functions, some kind of civic responsibility, some responsiveness is going to come along with it. So yeah, I'd say Trump's war on the universities. Trump is a good example of this dynamic. He is very proudly a crowd of the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. So he's himself a very proud Ivy Leaguer, but also a guy who's taking a hammer to it. J.D. Vance, Yale Law, kind of the sort of, kind of ultimate, kind of Marine officer candidate school for the American elite. It's, the ultimate elite formation. So yeah, I think that's gonna have to tend right, or else it'll keep getting hammered. And now I get to do the first pick of the best books we've read in 2025, and I am going to jump on this pick. I'm afraid that either Geoff or Ashley will take it. I'm going to go with Robert Remini's 3-volume magisterial biography of Andrew Jackson. We're not doing books that were only published in 2025, just any book. Robert Remini was a historian who taught at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he wrote his 3-volume biography of Jackson over the course of 2 decades, the 70s and the 80s. It's a very sympathetic account of Jackson, though it's critical at points. And I think it really situates Jackson as one of the very greatest American presidents, someone who absolutely belongs on Mount Rushmore. What's great about Jackson? Andrew Jackson is not the first president of the United States, but I think you can argue that he was the first American president. For all of his predecessors, there was still that kind of colonial stench, that kind of Whig powder and kind of British correctness, still too much looking back toward the mother country. But Jackson, who fought in the Revolutionary War as a boy and sustained wounds and was imprisoned when he was just 13 years old, detested the British, never felt any real attachment to the British crown. He moved from the Carolinas to the territory that would become Tennessee as a young man. He was president at the state convention that turned that territory into a state. Tennessee was the first state admitted to the Union after the 13 original colonies, and that's a glorious thing because it's a state that was not born into servitude, right? And the people at the convention chose the name Tennessee, an Indian name, because they wanted something that was American and not British, unlike those terrible royal names of Virginia, Georgia, Carolina, not only referring to the old world, which was bad enough, but to this, un-American institution of royalty. And so Jackson, has this American spirit. He embodies it. He really kind of creates the notion of America we now have as a single people, because he really, in his political career, advanced the notion that the president is the embodiment of the popular will. And before that, the president was some sort of national figurehead of this assemblage of states, but he wasn't seen as a vessel of the popular will. So Jackson really brings that about. And that's a very, very important part. It's not the founding. He's not, part of the founding generation or a founding father in conventional accounts, but he creates the America we now know. He's also, was a very, very effective military leader, an element of his greatness. Remini suggests that if Jackson had been sent north during the War of 1812, that Canada might now be part of the United States, which I think is plausible. Also, if Jackson had not won the Battle of New Orleans, America would look very different. The Battle of New Orleans had to be won to ratify the Louisiana Purchase. We probably would not have the whole American West had Jackson not won that battle. So, as a president, in terms of, just totally reworking our conception of America as a general, these are all just, really great elements of his career, and they're distinctions that very few Americans can equal. Grant was, as great a military leader, but less distinguished as a president. Lincoln was as distinguished as a president, but was not himself a man in arms, though he was commander in chief. So, Remini's book, so readable, so well done, and I think it's probably the best way to become a Jacksonian. Whether or not you're inclined to do that, I think he really makes the best case for it.
So, my perhaps surprising pick is Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man, which I read in full for the first time. I had read the essay a long time ago, but I had never read the actual book.
This is like when you were younger and there are these hipsters who said, well, my favorite show is Charles in Charge, and you kind of pick something that everyone just thinks is ridiculous and dumps on.
Pretty much, yeah.
But you're going to explain why it's really fine.
Yeah, so, it's particularly notable, I'd say, this year, in part because, it would seem that Trump's return to office consolidated, what some have called the end of history, this break with the neoliberal norms and sort of policy presumptions of the prior several decades, dating back to the early 1990s. And so, the most notable example would be Trump's attack on global free trade, through his aggressive use of tariffs, would seem to be really, one of the a sort of final death knell of the era that was inaugurated in part with Fukuyama's book. And so I read it for various reasons, in part because, as I said, I've been doing all this research involving the 90s, and obviously it's an important work from that era, and also because I was just thinking about the pivotal moment we seem to find ourselves in, so I was interested in going back to that prior pivotal moment of sort of epochal transition. And what I found was that the book, and I'm not at all claiming originality in this observation, but the book is much more prescient than it's often given credit for. And I wanted to point out, one line. So, just as a bit of background, Fukuyama's thesis depends on the idea that history is directional, that it takes a particular direction and is trending in a particular direction, which is, famously towards some form of liberal democracy. And he justifies this claim by identifying what he calls the mechanism, which is essentially the idea that the progress of science and technology is directional, that it implies a certain kind of tendency towards progress, and that politics and political forms kind of follow that same track. However, he does note some of the ambiguities and sort of problems that let's say a more kind of Pollyanna-ish version of his thesis might run into. And so I wanted to just quote one line where he says, "The mechanism underlying our directional history leads equally well to a bureaucratic authoritarian future as to a liberal one." So, in other words, he is recognizing something that I think people often claim that he did not recognize, which is that the trajectory he's describing could, instead of leading to something like the American version of liberal democracy, could lead to something more like China. And that would be, as I'm saying here, the bureaucratic authoritarian future. And so, in other words, he is actually identifying this possibility very clearly. And I mean, I could cite other passages where he goes into it at length. And so, without getting too bogged down in his argument as to why he still thinks that the liberal democratic version will win out over the bureaucratic authoritarian one, I just wanted to point out some sort of ironies and ambiguities of our current moment, which is that on one hand, I think you can argue that despite its being a sort of perceived as a break with the neoliberal order, I think the rise of Trump and other right-wing populists who, if you follow Fukuyama's work at places like Persuasion, which I do, he's obviously no no fan of any of these people, but Fukuyama does really think that part of why you are going to end up with some form of democracy rather than some form of authoritarianism is that part of this trajectory is driven by a demand for recognition, and that this is just something that you can't get around, that you can't just kind of skirt the fact that as society develops in a certain direction, citizens will demand to be recognized, to have their desires recognized, and to have the polity that they live in some way reflect some sense of what they of how they perceive themselves and what they want. And so the point is, I think what's ironic about the rise of Trumpism, which again Fukuyama detests, is that it does represent a sort of democratic rejection of certain fundamentally anti-democratic and arguably sort of bureaucratic authoritarian features of the prior order. And so to that extent, to the fact that, say, the way that trade was negotiated was largely by avoiding any democratic input, through these kind of opaque processes of the sort that produce things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and NAFTA and so on. That these were fundamentally attempts to kind of skirt the popular will and get around it. And so to that extent, I think you could argue that various of these kind of populist manifestations that Fukuyama is very critical of, nonetheless, I think do ratify aspects of his thesis, which is just that the popular demand for recognition will remain there. So the thing that I think is interesting, though, is that if you look at the sort of deep ideological fantasies coming out of the sort of intellectual apparatus around Trumpism, what you'll find is actually a desire for a kind of bureaucratic authoritarian solution to the impasses of ours. So even though it's a movement that's originally driven by a kind of popular demand for recognition on the part of people who felt a lack of representation under the current system, if you look at, obviously the most notable example of this would be Curtis Yarvin, but you can find other people in this realm of sort of intellectuals adjacent to Trump world and influential on sort of MAGA politics to some degree. In fact, what a lot of them fantasize about is a kind of circumvention of the popular will and a kind of bureaucratic authoritarianism, a sort of, the fantasy of the CEO monarch was the title of a piece we published about this. And, this idea that, we can just kind of, install some sort of king, and, that this is kind of the fantasy that this is part of why a lot of people on the right are very enchanted by the figure of Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, because he seems to embody this fantasy. And, so I suppose what's interesting is that it seems to me that this political movement that's sort of been lifted by the forces of kind of popular rejection of undemocratic governance, is itself seemingly poised to kind of retreat into this fantasy that it can just kind of govern without any kind of popular accountability. And so I think what's interesting here is that that there's a kind of process by which the sort of Fukuyaman direction of history seems to, on one hand, produce this tendency towards the public placing demands for recognition on those who govern, but then those who govern, repeatedly falling into this trap of trying to find ways to skirt around that or avoid it. And so it does seem that this basic dynamic that he described is one that we're still stuck with. And, if there is a new, I tend to think there actually isn't a new kind of coherent prevailing order that's really emerged yet out of the wreckage of the neoliberal one. But I tend to think that, Fukuyama's essential analysis of the dynamics will remain relevant regardless of how exactly the new kind of post-neoliberal order shakes out and what it comes to look like. So it's and that there's much more I could say, but I think, and I brought this up in terms of Doge, where I think you had again the same kind of fusion of a sort of populist-driven anger at the seeming unaccountability of the federal government to the people, but then at the same time, a sort of fantasy of a kind of technologically empowered bureaucracy that would essentially be unaccountable to and insulated from any kind of popular pressures. And so I think you see this basic set of dynamics kind of working themselves out over and over again. So I think the book remains very rich in insight and will continue to do so for several decades more.
Right, I'm going to lower the level here a little.
Good, thank you.
This was a little difficult to
Tired
do
of
because
Jeff's theory cell pontifications.
right, so this was so difficult because obviously in our line of work we read a lot, and I am not often reading because I want to read. I am going through a stack of books and papers because I'm looking for the answer to something. I'm trying to solve a problem, I'm trying to write something. And so there's lots of books that like give me a few lines. So I'm like, yes, that's it. And or they give me a useful background to something I kind of suspected or already knew. But there was one book I read this year. It's actually old. It was published in 2016. It's like super popular and just a regular normie book, I think anyway. It's The Existentialist Cafe. I loved that book. It was the first time I read it. I read it over the summer as like a light read. And I loved it because it's the kind of book, first of all, I enjoyed it. And there are very few books that I read, and I enjoy reading them. I didn't want to put it down, and it combines my two parts of who I am, which is like one of my hobbies is reading histories of objects. Like I just really love like history of the chair, history of salt, like how did we start sleeping with pillows? Like I really love that stuff, and like you get all this stuff about cocktails. It's great, you know. And there's a bit of gossip about Merleau-Ponty at the same time as it very clearly highlights and illustrates like the Heideggerian basis of existentialism and reminds us that Simone de Beauvoir was so much better than what current gender theory gives her credit for. So it was I thought it was a wonderful book, and I recommend it to everyone because it's just really fun. And it's the kind of book that I aspire to be able to write. So I've written 2 books that are very academic, difficult, and have a lot of backstory. Just like it's so typical academic. You got to give like 700 pages of like explanation before you're like, and here's my argument. You know, you're like scared to like put forward an argument. And I feel like I'm over that. And I would like to write a book that people want to read and that's interesting, but also puts forward a novel understanding. I mean, that's not like this book does that, but what I would like to do is put forward a novel understanding of some area of life that is both rigorous, but also, you know, actually interesting, actually makes you want to pick it up. I don't think I can ever do that. But I could try, you know, and it's that kind of book that makes you think, I want to try to write like this. I want to write this. I want to tell stories. And I think that's we're storytelling creatures. I think it's a fantastic way to give a philosophy, teach a philosophy, teach a history. And I wrote for our review of books, I wrote about Tiffany Jenkins' Strangers and Intimates, which I also read this year. And she does something very similar. She tells these stories, you know, she brings history to life where it's not just like, oh, the diet of worms. It's like amid the splendor and the room was full. They had to move it to a new room because so many people came, and you get the feeling of actually being there. And I love that because as someone who has to read endless theory and papers, just to read something with some color and some vibrancy and some life, it's fantastic, and it doesn't punish you for picking it up. So that's my vote for my book of the year that I read this year, which is like 10 years old, but it was really fun. And I think really a model of how, you know, you can write a good book.
Ashley, film of the year. What do you got?
Oh God, this is so bad. So I am so uncultured. And you guys are so cultured. When you're
Films
talking,
aren't
I'm
cultural.
sitting there like
Films aren't culture. They're entertainment for the masses.
Yeah, well, I've got 2 small children, right? So if I've got control of the TV, it must be 1 a.m. or something because like everybody in my house
So
is
give us
sleeping.
your take on K-pop Demon Hunters.
Oh, actually, do you know what? That is a great movie. That's actually really, really good. I've seen it 36 times. I know it off by heart. My children are currently reenacting it right now. So yeah, but you know what? I rewatched my favorite movie of all time, and I watched it like frame by frame, Contact. And I absolutely love this movie. And so I'm gonna give an old movie. Contact's from 1997, but I rewatched it this year. And it was the first time, because I was on a plane, I actually managed to watch it the way that I want to watch a movie, which is pause, go back 5 minutes, watch it again, pause, go back 5 minutes, watch it again. I don't know, am I autistic? That's how I watch movies that I like to watch. And I noticed so many things about it. And God, the awe of seeing something beyond yourself. I just love films like that. Most of the movie is so boring. And then you get those 20 minutes, those glorious 20 minutes where she actually goes through the wormhole and goes to Vega. And it's just absolutely extraordinary. And when people talk about, like, when they're depressed, they go to therapy, or they're feeling down, they got to go talk about themselves. I do not understand that at all. If I'm feeling bad about myself or something like that, first of all, it means I'm, like, bored. But second of all, I will go and read about Vega. I will go and watch Contact. I will go and read about star systems and constellations and planets and wormholes and the Alcubierre drive. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, because it makes me forget about myself, and it makes me feel like humanity is part of something so vast and extraordinary, and that my one lifetime is just this one little bit. Like she's like, but the rest of humanity needs to see what I'm seeing right now. The Jodie Foster character says in the film, and he says this is just one step. And, D.L. Jacobs said to me in an interview that we did, he said, people in the Enlightenment used to say that my afterlife is in society. Humanity does have an afterlife. My afterlife is in society. And that's how I sort of feel connected to the vastness of time, is through reading about these things and seeing these kinds of films. Is like, I know I'm overplaying such a simple movie, but yeah, it's like that you feel that you are part of one step. And I'm impatient and annoyed that I'm not going to live long enough to see the next step. But I also feel, I'm very Hegelian about these things, but I also feel that I am part of the vastness of the unfolding of the human spirit in society. And so these little reminders, there's so few films that do that are so, it's a pessimistic film, and they have to put a lot of crap in there about, like, put faith and Interstellar does the same thing. Interstellar is almost basically the sequel to Contact. And it always, like, has to put in all this crap about, but what about love? Love transcends, junk. But it is nonetheless that those little moments of science, of human progress, of reaching beyond, of being part of something else, are so optimistic and give us this glimpse of the best that humanity can hope for, and put it on film for, like, just 10 minutes before disappointing us again. And I just wish more films did that. And there are so few that do. And when you get it a little bit, you get this, where they let you kind of walk around on another planet for a little while. They then turn around and insult you. Like, oh, you don't want a film about philosophers floating around in space. You want to see aliens kill a guy. I'm like, no, I actually do want to just talk philosophy while floating around in space. It's fantastic. That's the best thing I could possibly imagine. And nobody really does that. And Contact only had the gall to do it for like 15 minutes. And Interstellar, brought that out a little bit more, with a bit more of a hard science edge to it. But I want more films like that. And these are literally the only two films that give it to me. The only two films that give it to me. And I have to watch them over and over and over and over again. Pause, rewind, watch again. And so filmmakers out there, make me another one, please. There aren't any more, and I want more. Or, scientists, let's go to Vega. Please, soon.
Geoff, what you got?
Well, I'm going to do Eddington, although Ashley's remarks made me kind of want to do Bugonia because Andromeda is so important to that. But in any case, I'll do Eddington because I think it's a more important film ultimately. So I've written about it previously, so people can check that out on Substack. The first great COVID movie, maybe the last, or something along those lines, was the title. And Eddington, it's probably the only significant work of art produced out of the madness of 2020. So, and if we're thinking of events, the sort of Badiou event, clearly there was something about the COVID event that shifted everything on some profound level. And it's a film that sort of attempts to document that. And it's just, I think, remarkable in part because the experience of living through the early months of the pandemic was just so unpleasant and full of absurdity. And it's both like unpleasant because of how just kind of awkward and humiliating much of what went on is, but also because a lot of it happened on screens and was sort of occurred in this strangely kind of the most important kind of social events often occurred in these strangely antisocial forms, which are very hard to dramatize or depict. And so I think the film is remarkable for having produced such a perfectly cringe-inducing depiction of what those months were like in all of their kind of quotidian horror. And so on that level, it's just a very important historical document because of its realism about what all of that was like. Beyond that, obviously, it sort of has an importance to kind of the political moment that it appeared in, which was early second Trump administration. And without going into too much detail about that, I think part of what it anticipated, insofar as it was able to sort of prophesy, that there would be this, or I suppose people had already said the vibe shift was underway, but obviously by the time the film was complete, it was not yet. The filmmakers did not have direct experience of what the second Trump term would be like. And so I think in that sense, it's strikingly prophetic. One thing that's been notable that I've also written about is the return of political assassinations as a feature of American life. And that is something that is I think prophetically included in this film. The assassination, and then the assassination becomes the kind of hinge point of the film, after which it goes from this, again, kind of awkward, cringe-inducing realism into this much more kind of conspiratorial phantasmagoria. And I think the way that it depicts that, and the ambiguity of how it portrays the kind of disintegration of reality, of any kind of recognizable shared reality in film, is very apt and captures what I think is the experience of most of us at this time in history. And I think the other thing that's sort of interesting about it is that it doesn't even though it doesn't have the ability to, again, directly comment on the second Trump term, I think in effect the conclusion of it is actually a commentary on the second Trump term, kind of produced avant la lettre, which essentially shows that this kind of aesthetic vibe shift and the sort of public embrace of a kind of strangely conspiratorial worldview that posits itself as oppositional to these kind of shadowy elements can in a way become the new justification of the status quo. And so I think, I just saw the other day, just as a simple example of this, Tulsi Gabbard, now the director of national intelligence, was on Twitter just a few days ago, sort of railing against the deep state. So I suppose the question here is what it means for the director of national intelligence to be railing against the deep state. But that is something like the scenario that is portrayed at the end of the film, where you have the person who, would seem to be in charge of this entity, simultaneously positing herself as oppositional to it. And so that does seem to be kind of the new form of politics. And I'd say in the closing section of the film, it diagnoses that very, very clearly.
Yeah, I've had a slightly disappointing film year. I expected that the new 4K Blu-ray of Ben-Hur, directed by William Wyler, one of my very favorite directors, would be out at the end of this year, but it still doesn't have a release date. So it's been it's been really tough for me film-wise, but one high point has been seeing my sons come to love the films of Buster Keaton. Buster Keaton is the less well-known, but I think greater silent era comedian alongside Charlie Chaplin. And, you know, what is his greatness? It's really his kind of stoicism, his willingness to not demand that we love him and applaud him in the way that Chaplin does. And the Keaton movie my kids are most enthusiastic about right now is The Navigator, where Keaton plays the sap, kind of recurring character of his, who doesn't really know anything. He doesn't know how to communicate to a woman his regard for her. He doesn't know how to open a can. He doesn't know how to kind of walk from one house to the next. He's just somehow comprehensively incompetent. And in The Navigator, the sap accidentally is sort of set out to sea on this large ship with the woman he loves. And they have to kind of make a house together, make a life together in an impromptu way. And they encounter savages, and he has underwater adventures, and it's delightful. And I didn't think my kids would really take to this film in the way I did. I thought they would always prefer something like the more famous Keaton film, The General, but they love The Navigator. And I became persuaded that my sons were really tapping into the essence of Keaton when my oldest was asking to watch this film, and he said, "Can we watch the movie with the slippery guy who's trying to find somewhere safe?" And I thought that was such a good description of Keaton. He's this slippery guy. He's always kind of falling or flailing, and he's just somehow trying to find somewhere safe, a kind of place in the world where he fits and where he's able to extend his arms without knocking something down. So yeah, Keaton, The Navigator, that's got to be the best film I've really relished this year. With that, thank you, Ashley and Geoff. Thanks to our producer, Stephen Adebato. For more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.